In a novel published many, many years ago now, an author has told the wild story of a man named Ellerby. Ellerby was a good man, a very nice man. He never swore. He loved his wife. He felt a keen obligation for others. He worked hard and believed in God. Now, Ellerby operated a liquor store in Milwaukee. It had once flourished, but over the years the neighborhood had gone downhill, people left, and crime increased. And Ellerby's store became a target, a favorite target of armed robbers. During one of the robberies, two of Ellerby's clerks had been shot. One was killed, the other was left crippled and brain dead. Ellerby felt an obligation to their families, however, and took it upon himself to support them, even though he was suffering financial problems of his own. His wife was very angry that he continued to pay his clerks' salaries, but Ellerby was adamant about his responsibility for them. Ellerby also helped support his adopted parents who lived in a retirement home in Phoenix. His wife was angry about that as well, since they could barely make ends meet. But then Ellerby was approached by a buyer for his store and made such a handsome profit that he was able to open a new store in a nice, safe neighborhood. He worked hard to make the store a success, worked late every night and even stayed open on Sundays until at last the store began to flourish like the old one once did. He no longer had to work on Sundays and even found a clerk who could be trusted enough to run the store in his absence and allow him some time off. Things were finally looking up for Ellerby, and so he and his wife decided to go away for a while, fly out to Phoenix to visit his parents. On the day they were to depart, Ellerby went to the store to give his clerk some last-minute instructions. As he was walking out, he stopped to straighten a window display. At that very moment, a car came careening down the street, chased by the police. It was the getaway car of a bank robber. The thief lost control as he approached Ellerby's store and plowed right through the front window as Ellerby stood there rearranging bottles of wine. The car smashed the window, smashed the bottles, and smashed Ellerby too. The next thing Ellerby knew, he was in heaven. It was far different than he had imagined. He was overcome by its great beauty and felt it was going to be just wonderful being in heaven where he knew he belonged. Unfortunately, St. Peter had something else in mind for Ellerby. He sent Ellerby straight to hell. And having tasted heaven, Ellerby's torment in hell was much greater. To make matters even worse, more intolerable and incomprehensible, who should he meet up with but the bank robber who'd run him over? Ellerby just couldn't understand what had happened. Why he had ended up in hell with him of all people, and with every other kind of criminal and misfit and deviant. Why he would not been allowed to stay in heaven with all the other good people like himself. After all, he'd been a nice man. He had loved his wife. He had looked after others. He worked hard and believed in God. And surely he was a better person than the bank robber and all those other bad people. And in his great torment, Ellerby cried out to God for an explanation. He wanted answers. He wanted reasons. And none of that Job stuff, Ellerby wailed. None of that where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth stuff. He wanted straight answers, clear explanation. And so Ellerby waited in silence for God to show himself. Suddenly, the silence was shattered like glass as God thundered. Because you stayed open on the Sabbath. What? Ellerby cried, not believing his ears. You stayed open on the Sabbath just when you got started in your new location, God bellowed. You mean, Ellerby stammered, because I worked on Sundays? That's why? You took my name in vain, God said, his voice rumbling through hell. I what? Ellerby said. You took my name in vain, God replied. The volume of his voice turned down just a bit now. You said, oh God, under your breath, when your wife was nagging you about sending money to the families of your clerks. She mocked you when you said that you were under obligation. That's when you said it. That's when you said it. I heard you. That's why I'm here? Ellerby exclaimed. Hey, you wanted an explanation, God responded. Well, there's your explanation. Anyway, you felt lust in your heart. What? You felt lust in your heart, God said. I did not, Ellerby protested. Yes, you did, God shot back. Yes, you did. Remember that time you saw your neighbor sunning herself in her bikini? I never felt anything, Ellerby insisted. Oh, right, yeah, tell me another one, God said. And anyway, you didn't honor your father and mother. Ellerby was stunned, but I did. I always honored my father and mother. I supported them. I was going out to visit them the day I was run down. Oh, them, God said. They only adopted me. I went to your natural parents. But I never knew my natural parents, Ellerby cried. I was just an infant. And God said, so? Ellerby couldn't believe it. That's why, he screamed. And God said, because you went dancing, you wore zippers in your pants and drove automobiles, you smoked cigarettes and sold demon rum. Ellerby was beside himself. This is your explanation? He wailed. And God exploded. You thought heaven was like a theme park, Disney World in the sky. That's why. And Ellerby reeled with disbelief. This was the explanation he got. God's answer. And Ellerby roamed the regions of hell for what seemed like an eternity, trying to figure it all out. Then one day he found himself assembled with all humankind standing before God on Judgment Day. And all humankind, the residents of heaven and the residents of hell, were condemned because, as God put it, he never found an audience. He never found anyone who fully admired or appreciated his wonder and power, the richness and beauty and wildness of creation. And then in a twinkling of an eye, it was all gone. Everything. Everyone. Well, as I said, it's a wild story. Because it's a story that portrays to an absurd and absolutely hilarious degree what it would be like if God was actually like what God is often believed to be like. A story that pictures God the way belief often pictures God, and it pictures, too, the absurd consequences of what that would be. And how does belief often picture God? Not as the God of all creation, not a God of wonder, power, and mystery, not a God of astounding grace and generosity, but as a God who has rules and rewards those who obeys the rules. A God who is above all fair, who plays by the rules. That was Ellerby's God. And Ellerby figured he'd struck a good bargain with God. Ellerby would follow the rules and God would reward him. Ellerby would be a nice guy and God would be nice to him. Ellerby would be good and God would be good to him. All Ellerby wanted was for God to stick to his end of the bargain, to get what he deserved. And that's exactly, though, what Ellerby got. Ellerby's belief was not in a God of grace and mercy, but in a God of rules and his own ability to obey the rules. What Ellerby didn't bargain on, of course, was that in his view, no room for slip-ups. He couldn't have it both ways. If he demanded that God be fair and not be gracious and merciful, then God in his mercy, or in his fairness, must punish any and all mistakes. Being better than someone else didn't count. A slip-up was a slip-up. And since Ellerby did slip up here and there, did violate the rules, the only fair thing for God to do was to kick him out of heaven. In other words, Ellerby got exactly what he deserved, according to Ellerby's own way of figuring things. Really, the story of Ellerby is a story of a man finding himself in a hell of his own making hearing absurd explanations from a small and petty God of his own imagining. And you and I, how do we picture God? The way Ellerby pictured God, or the way Jesus pictured God? And the way Jesus pictured God becomes clear in another wild story, a wild story Jesus told. That story of the landowner who went out early one morning and hired workers for his vineyard, agreeing to pay them the usual daily wage. Later that same morning, he went out and hired more workers, then again at noon and 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock, simply promising to pay them what he thought was right. When evening came and it was time to pay the workers, the last hired were the first to be paid. And to their utter amazement, they received the full daily wage. Those hired first saw what the last hired received and figured, they were going to receive a lot more than they had agreed to. Much more. But when their turn came, they received exactly what the others did. And they got steamed. Really steamed. Wasn't right, they grumbled. Wasn't fair. Yes, they had received exactly what they had been promised. But it wasn't fair to pay those others who didn't work as long and hard as they did. They shouldn't be paid the same. That's what the first hired couldn't handle. The generosity of the owner. The freedom to do what he liked with what was his. They wanted each to receive only what they had earned and deserved. And God is like that landowner, Jesus is saying. God is gracious and generous, who gives freely and fully. A God who does not go by our rules, who's not bound by our notion of fairness. God is not fair at all, Jesus is saying. God is free to do what God chooses. Now, how we react to the story very much depends on whom we identify with in the story. If we identify with the first hired workers, we probably don't like the story at all. And chances are, those are the ones we identify with. We often see ourselves as the one who's borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. See ourselves as the responsible ones, the ones who work hard, pay our taxes to support those who sit idle in the marketplace, who don't do their share. We are the ones who do the committee work, put in long hours, take the heat, carry the burden. And we look around and see others getting something for nothing, not doing their share and yet benefiting anyway, not pulling their load. And we get angry because it's not fair. But are we the first hired? Could it be that we are always more like the last hired? That from God's perspective, we have always shown up at 5 o'clock, as someone else has put it? Could it be we receive God's graciousness and generosity of gift and blessing and forgiveness far more than we've ever earned or deserved? And so instead of getting angry because others benefit, instead of comparing ourselves to others and crying out about unfairness, maybe we should just get down on our knees and thank God. Because God is unfair. Because God doesn't, thank God, give us what we deserve. Rather, God shows us a mercy we don't deserve, surprises us with a forgiveness we could never earn, graces and blesses us with gifts we really have no right to. The truth of our lives is that people often love us more than we deserve. The gifts of friendship and care which we could never rightfully expect are given. Opportunities or possibilities we did nothing to create come our way. Jesus calls us to a fresh view of God. Not a God of rules and fairness, as we figure fairness, but a God who is free to be God. A God of wonder and power and mystery that asks us to trust Him. Trust His grace and generosity. Trust Him even in this chaotic world in which things often don't make sense, this world of beauty and horror and joy and pain. Trust that He is present and will keep gracing us with gifts of life and new possibility. And give thanks and rejoice and be generous and gracious people ourselves. Of course, you may prefer Ellerby's God and insist that God plays by the rules and gives you exactly what you deserve. let me tell you something. Not me. I'll take the God of Jesus any day. The God of all creation. The God of grace and mercy and love. Amen.
Amen.